It is my pleasure today to introduce our luncheon keynote speaker. Steve Corneely is the Senior Vice President for Policy and Strategy at NRG Energy. He has extensive experience in climate change policy, having held a number of related roles at NRG. His current role focuses primarily on clean technologies and sustainable enterprises. Steve sits on the board of the Climate Action Reserve, a leading certifier of GHG offset methodologies, and I'm certain his remarks this afternoon will be very illuminating. And so, without further ado, please help me to welcome Steve Corneely.
Well, it's truly an honor to be here, and I walked over here this morning through the Rice campus, and it made me appreciate this event and this venue. I think there's two things that make it stand out. One, it's at the middle of one of the nation's great universities, and in a institute that's dedicated to the study and teaching of policy, sciences, public affairs practice, and how to think carefully and well about major social problems. And the second is, it's co-sponsored by our great friends from France, and who not only helped inspire America to adopt, a bunch of democratic ideas in the late 18th century, but have been partners ever since, helping us win our independence and helping push forward lots of frontiers in science and knowledge and progress ever since. So thanks to you all for coming together. It's also an honor really to follow the two panels this morning, and a bit of a challenge because I could just say a bunch of the same stuff over again, and I don't think you'd appreciate that. And there's no need to, because they gave, I think, just comprehensive views. So I want to talk instead of about how great NRG is, though I'll give us a little snapshot to help you kind of place my comments in context. I really want to talk about the climate problem through two lenses. One is the lens of policy, which in effect our first panel talked about, and the other is the lens of business, which our second panel talked about. And I have three big sort of sections of my very brief comments. So the first one is a little bit about NRG, and I'm going to try to, in that, help you understand what we, and particularly me, have learned from us doing a bunch of the things that our colleagues and competitors in the previous panel talked about, and how that really relates to the climate challenge, and essentially the challenge that the parties and everybody else who attends or goes to Paris during the Conference of the Parties are going to be dealing with. The second thing is I want to tell you a little bit about a great book I read last year that helps understand why we as human beings don't always think very clearly, and sometimes we make mistakes, which I think is fundamentally related to the problems that we face in the policy and the business world in terms of addressing climate. And then the third thing is I want to talk about a few examples of some hopefully things that you may all think are not thought errors or making mental mistakes in thinking about some policy issues that are facing us in the climate space here and now. So let me start with a snapshot about NRG. We are, in Houston, many people know us because this is one of our regional headquarters and the main headquarter of our Reliant and our entire retail energy marketing brand. And I've talked to many people today who tell me they buy electricity from us at retail, and I'm very pleased to hear that. And I think, obviously those people have made a great choice in terms of where to spend their dollars and on their energy service. We also have a huge wholesale business in Texas, and part of our even huger wholesale business as an independent power producer. We have about 50,000 megawatts of generating equipment of various kinds throughout the United States. I think that makes us the second largest power generating fleet in the U.S. and the largest IPP in the U.S. And all of those assets none of them are in a rate base. They're all competitively developed, operated as merchants or under contracts or various other kinds of arm's length commercial agreements with people. So we're not a utility in that regard. We sell electricity to retail customers over here, and we generate it and sell it in wholesale markets over here. And we wear the risk of those things working. A lot of those assets burn fossil fuels, and we're one of the larger, always in the top 4 or 5 of emitters of CO2 in the United States, which means that when we think about climate change, we think about not just the way we have something that could solve it, but the way we have something that needs a solution itself. So when it comes to climate change, NRG's management and our sort of corporate view is that climate change is very real, it's very serious, it's a growing moral problem, it's a growing social problem, it's a growing national defense and security problem. And it's a growing problem for people who are in the fossil fuel industry, because we need to change because it's such a big problem. So we're very interested in changing our footprint and helping other companies and policymakers figure out how to change their footprint to achieve the 2-degree centigrade targets that we hope the INDCs at the COP will get maybe a quarter or a third of the way towards, because that's an important first step. But we actually, as a company, have set ourselves the goal of reducing our CO2 emissions by 50% by 2030 and by 90% by 2050, while at the same time growing the commercial value of our core generating business and other new businesses that we're engaged in. So that's a snapshot of NRG. Now, the way we're doing that, achieving those goals or trying to achieve those goals, our strategy for achieving those goals really focuses in 2 areas. One is our existing assets, where all the CO2 comes from, and the other is new kinds of technologies, business models, things that we can invest in that will help us create more value that is also low carbon or zero carbon. And I won't go into the same kind of length that you just heard, because I would just be repeating a bunch of stuff that you heard from NG and EDF, really. So, but basically, when we think about our existing plants, we think about really 3 basic things that can be done. One we call those sometimes the 3 R's, or at least I do. One is repower assets that burn coal to burn gas. The other is renew those assets, do something completely different with them, like, for example, capture the CO2 from coal plants and use it to recover additional oil from oil fields that are spent, or enhanced oil recovery, and potentially other uses in the future for that, to turn that CO2 from an environmental liability to a commercial asset. And the third is probably the least exciting. It's sometimes you have to retire a plant that's outlived its commercial usefulness, and then you have the opportunity to augment the fleet through acquisitions or development of additional resources. So those are the kinds of things, really simple things, that we think can take us from our current emissions to 50% by 2030 and to 90% by 2050, which, by the way, are our estimate of what it takes, for us to do our share of achieving the 2-degree centigrade path from the IPCC science. At the same time, we have a bunch of things that we think are able to create even more value than, and by the way, we think every one of those things can enhance value that I just identified, rather than give it up or lose it, if we do it in a smart business-like way. But in addition, we see lots of opportunities, as the previous panel talked about, in terms of new types of businesses, new types of resources, distributed generation, smart loads, smart thermostats, smart appliances, ancillary value like electric vehicle. If we make electricity, electric vehicles use electricity. So electric vehicle charging networks seem like a great synergy with our business. And even things that are, business, whether it's businesses going 100% renewable, supplying them with renewables like our friends and friendly competitors at EDF talked about, providing hospitals with reliability services that use a combination of renewables and combined heat and power, providing individual homeowners with not only retail electricity, but solar and other smart appliances in their home. So we see tremendous growth in that market. And I won't go into it, but I will say that one of the things that I don't think we talked about very much, John touched on it actually in his comments, is the challenge of integrating those different resources into a business model, into markets, and into the electric system. The electric system does face tremendous complicated reliability constraints, and it's a market, and much everywhere we do business there's a wholesale electricity market. Certainly there's one of the more robust markets in Texas, in ERCOT. Integrating those resources into markets in ways that actually unlocks market value rather than suppressing it, integrating them into business-to-business markets and business-to-consumer markets, integrating them into financial markets, because after all, if investors don't like what we're doing, we have to do something better and different, because all this stuff takes capital, and then integrating them into the grid so they provide reliability. To me, the missing piece in the electric sector and most of the conversations about innovation and decarbonization focus on this. The hole in the discussions are how do we integrate these different gadgets and gizmos and technologies that not only have to satisfy this customer and that customer and the other customer, they also have to integrate into the grid, they have to integrate into the electricity markets, and they have to integrate into the financial markets. They have to attract capital. So to me, where I want to leave this part of it and move on to the next part of my comments is with the takeaway for you all, that it is really these systems that matter in terms of achieving carbon emission reductions. It's not just plugging in a windmill, a solar panel, a smart thermostat, an electric vehicle, or a carbon capture thing on the back end of a coal plant. Those are all essential pieces of it, but making the whole system work together is sort of the missing piece that needs to be solved in order for us to achieve the emission reductions that all of the Earth's serious climate scientists tell us need to be achieved at a very quick rate. So systems, not just gizmos and gadgets and technologies. So let me go from from that to some thoughts about why we're having such a hard time solving not just that problem, but the whole problem. There's a scientist, a psychiatrist, a psychologist at Princeton named Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for tremendous contributions to his field. He wrote a book, I think it just came out in 2014. I read it in 2014. It was like the best book I read in several years. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And I thought maybe at Rice University we could talk a little bit about thinking. And when we think about policy, we should probably talk about thinking. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about this book. The basic question in the book is, why do we make so many mistakes when we think about stuff? And, nobody likes to say they make mistakes, but, I do. I make lots of mistakes. And I find my friends and colleagues and, people that I talk with in public often making mistakes. And not that I find it out right away, because, I might be wrong, because I make mistakes. But we make a lot of mistakes in thinking. And Kahneman, this whole book is like, why does that happen? And his answer, it's a very big book, but I'll simplify it way down. His answer is that we have evolved two different structures for thinking, over the course of like hundreds of millions of years. One is that we have this automatic sort of thought process that he calls thinking fast, and the other is that we have this more laborious system that we have to actually force ourselves to do with rules that we have to force ourselves to learn, called thinking slow. And thinking fast is evolutionary really important, because you don't want to stop and figure out, like, is that really a saber-toothed tiger that's about to jump on you and crush your neck when there's a noise in the bushes? You have to react quickly. And When there's a contest for dominance in the tribal unit, you don't want to go back and contemplate it. You want to stand tall and drop your opponent with a well-placed thwack with a bone club or something. So we've evolved to have this very, very rapid thinking thing. And then there's this slower system that is why we go to school and learn stuff, because that can be channeled and used to solve really important problems like math and physics and chemistry and Sudokus and stuff. So the trouble with the one reason we make mistakes, and this to me is the single biggest takeaway from this book, is that Kahneman says we systematically, when we run into a complex problem that we don't understand, our minds, the fast-thinking trick that we all inherited from some ancestor who survived the saber-toothed tiger attack, is we will substitute a very simple problem for the complex problem. We will solve the simple problem, and we will tell ourselves we solved the complex problem. And if you think about it, you got to recognize that in yourself and like your colleagues, and maybe especially your boss. I don't know, but it's a very common thing. And what this tends to do is, A, it's usually wrong, or it's usually not fully right. B, it tends to produce this very dichotomous thing, like this is the right answer and everything else is the wrong answer. I'm right, you're wrong. Some of us have had debates over the years where it's been like we're right and you're wrong, or this happens in the policy environment a lot. We see it in public discourse. Right, wrong, left, right, red, blue, state, federal, Democrat, Republican. As a business person, I tend to think those are all distractions from figuring out how to create value. And finally, we tend to reward this socially. Everybody likes a strong, decisive figure who can make rapid decisions and avoid analysis paralysis. We reward people who are assertive and can say things simply in debates, who can be confrontational and sum it up in a word. They seem to poll well after debates. So, it's very popular, but it's divisive. And when we think about this complex problem where we are tempted to jump in with simple solutions, there's no more complex problem than climate change and how to solve it. So let me present three simple propositions that often come up as answers in the climate debates that I think sometimes and to some degree are a result of fast thinking. We need a price on carbon. If renewables are cheap enough, hey, we've solved the problem, is when they're cheaper than gas and coal. Oh, and we need policy. We need policy to make these things happen. Those are three very, very common. I actually believe most of those things most of the time, so they're very common, and I think we've heard them repeatedly today. But let's peel the onion just a little bit on those and think about them. Price on carbon. That's the right answer on a blackboard if you're trained in simple economics like I am. You draw a supply curve and a demand curve and a social cost of carbon curve, and you say, whoop, we got to internalize that little gap. We better put on a Pagovian tax. We've solved the problem, move on. Next problem. Bang, bang. No analysis paralysis here. It's maybe the wrong answer when we think about how to reduce CO2 emissions effectively in the next 10 years. And I think that the clearest example of this came up that I think really is relevant for this audience and this geography when the EPA's proposed Clean Power Plan proposal was analyzed by ERCOT, and they said, wow, if we achieve these CO2 emission reductions in 2020 that are required in the proposed plan, using a trading price system, which is the most efficient, most effective way to do it, we will shut down a third of the coal plants in the state right away, or maybe a half, and we'll have immediate reliability problems. And that analysis and a number like it are quoted in the EPA's final rule when they say, well, you know, we changed that so that it's phased in over the full period between now and 2030 instead of right up front in 2020, and we give states opportunities to do things besides. They could do a price on carbon, or they could do other stuff, or they could do a combination. So while a price in carbon, in my view, in the long run is like essential for like helping drive innovation and helping drive incentives towards solutions, in the short run, too much, too fast could actually create significant problems like the ones ERCOT pointed out in their analysis. Shut down too many plants that are needed for reliability, you very quickly replace them with nothing but new gas plants, and you lock out new renewables development, and you prevent the kind of integration or innovation of all the stuff that I just mentioned that we're doing, that EDF is doing, that NG is doing, and that everybody is trying to do in the power system, which is smart loads, smart demand response, low-tech storage like water heaters, filling them up, heating them up when energy's low and using them when energy's high, high-tech things like batteries, efficient new gas combined with renewables, ways to make sure that we keep our zero carbon nukes online instead of pushing them offline. I mean, these are things that an immediate price on carbon would not help with most of those goals, whereas a slow phased in one over time gives time to solve the problems in a thoughtful way. Let's go to the second one. If renewables, if the price is cheap enough, we've solved the climate problem. Well, that's the right answer if you're looking at like on a blackboard and saying, or a bar graph like we saw earlier, this costs $48 and that costs $56, so this is good, or whatever the numbers are. That's insightful. I do that all the time. It's very compelling and interesting. But that doesn't mean that that's the way to solve the climate problem, because as John pointed out, there's periods when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, and you need something else. And a more deeper problem, again, that we can illustrate just looking at ERCOT, is there's about 11,000 megawatts of minimum load in ERCOT. When on a cool night when nobody's using much air conditioning, nobody's using much heating, there's about 11,000 or 10,000 megawatts of load. And every night, other night than that, there's more. Nuclear plants and coal plants with CCS, like the one we're working to develop at the William Parish plant about 18 miles away from here, they need to run in a lot of hours a year to be able to be economic to operate. If you have a lot of renewables impinging on that 10,000 or 11,000 megawatts of room that nuclear plants and CCS plants need to run, it makes them not run. And if they don't run, they stop being economic, and they become less economic to plan and build. So, and the wind in West Texas blows at least 40% of the time at night. So, there's an issue. If we want to think about more renewables and less carbon, we have to think about a way to integrate those two objectives of some baseload power that is zero carbon, some baseload and intermediate power with CCS that can use ample fossil fuels without emitting CO2, and have lots of renewables. And that's not the same as just saying, well, renewables are cheaper, so everybody will build them and we've solved the problem. We might have made the problem worse from a CO2 perspective if we displace a bunch of zero carbon existing resources, preempt the entry of a bunch of new ones like CCS, and instead rely on a bunch of cheap, low cost, but still fairly carbon intensive gas to solve the problem whenever the wind stops blowing or when the sun stops shining. So that's more complicated. And finally, the policy thing. So the policy, policy is like, it's like the Bonnaroo of fast thinking, despite the efforts of economists and policy institutes to sort of go through and figure things out with the slow thinking, a lot of policy is just sort of like, this is the right solution, let's go do it, everybody vote for it, or everybody vote against it, or everybody support it, or everybody litigate. So policy is an area that is particularly full of pitfalls in terms of fast thinking. And this brings me to, I think, like if you think about policy from a business perspective, there's really, I see three basic forks in the road. On this fork, we see a lot of companies doing this. My company certainly has. I've been the spokesperson for it from time to time, say, we want that policy, we need that policy, that's a good policy because it's good for our bottom line, and we think it's going to be good for, climate or whatever other public concern we're trying to solve. Then there's the opposite, which is you can say, well, no, we have to oppose that policy because it's bad for our bottom line, or it's bad for our community, or it's bad for our business, or it shifts costs from rich people to poor people, which may or may not be fully true, but we say this is bad or this is good, dichotomous outcome. The third thing is businesses can say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to sit here and think about what do I need to make this system, going back to my first point, it's not just this technology or that technology. It's the system that I need to make money for my shareholders and create value for my customers that isn't there yet. And how can policy help create that system? And in that sense, business can help drive solutions as opposed to falling into the dichotomous thing. And of course, to do that well, we have to engage in a little slow thinking as well as some fast thinking. So to me, that's the big sort of takeaway that I bring from this part of the discussion, is that business's role really fundamentally, the most positive role that I think business can play in this is to go beyond the simply sort of opposing or supporting things, and to be part of figuring out what the business solution is, the system solution that we can attract capital to, that we can create value for customers with, and that we can actually execute and scale up, because that's what it's going to take to solve the climate problem. And when I think about the INDCs, it's like the speaker, Ms. Ogi said on the first panel, it's like the Chinese word. The problem, the crisis, is that the INDCs are not going to get there even if people actually deliver on them. That's just not enough. The good news is the opportunity is everybody's beginning to be aware of the need for solutions, and this creates an opportunity, not for simple-minded canards like a price on carbon or make renewables cheap, not that there's anything particularly bad about those, but actually for figuring out how to drive the actual solutions that we in the business community feel we can, if we stretch, we can attract capital successfully, create value for customers, and create social value at the same time. So I think that that's a huge opportunity. Now let me just go from the COP and Paris to the Clean Power Plan and Texas and talk about a couple of the things that might be out of the box and different from, that might be some sort of slow thinking efforts instead of just a fast thinking effort. Megan this morning mentioned that one of the things that the Clean Power Plan offers is this thing called state measures. So the state can choose a cap and trade system, or they can choose a rate-based system, or they can choose a state measures system. Now, a cap and trade system, if somebody wants fast thinking, says we need a price on carbon, we need a high price on carbon, we've heard the social price of carbon, we've heard higher than that, we've heard lower than that already today. Cap and trade system gives a state a way to do that. They can do that under the Clean Power Plan. If they want to subsidize, if they want renewables to be cheaper than fossils, there's a way to do that under the Clean Power Plan, or at least to try to do it. You can do a rate-based system and subsidize renewables by letting them sell emission rate credits into a national market, if there is one, if enough other states adopt it. So there's the two fast-thinking ways. But the state measures thing seems to me to provide a slow-thinking approach that is really interesting. ERCOT redid their analysis of the Clean Power Plan after there's there's sort of this would be a bad idea analysis of the proposed plan. They did one that was just released. I believe it was released last Thursday, but anyway, it's nearly brand new on the final rule. And in that rule, they had a really interesting result, which is if about 8 gigawatts, or somewhere between 5 and 8 gigawatts, depending on how you count it, of coal in Texas retires, which, by the way, is maybe a quarter to a third of the existing coal fleet, and a bunch of that is the ERCOT thinks would retire because of some other environmental regulations and low gas prices sort of anyway. If that retires, ERCOT would be in compliance, Texas would be in Clean Power Plan through about 2025. Nothing else. In a cap and trade system, that means the price would be zero. There'd be excess allowances lying around on the ground that wouldn't be worth anything because nobody was exceeding the budget. But what the EPA's Clean Power Plan allows with this state measures things is for a state to say, we're going to have a different approach for starters to compliance with the Clean Power Plan. And in the case, one of the things that's sprinkled throughout the Clean Power Plan as an example is a state could go to the owners of affected units and say, if you would like to retire your plant sometime between now and the end of this first or the second compliance period, let us know and maybe we can work out a deal that would be written into your permit. And if they get enough of those, to not exceed, to keep emissions below the state budgets, that's the plan they can file. And they don't have to do anything else. They don't have to adopt a cap and trade program. They don't have to adopt an emission rate trading program. They don't have to do anything that might be objectionable in a state that doesn't like cap and trade. They do have to have a backstop program that would turn on if the emissions didn't meet that level. They can do other things like incentivize new renewables or distributed resources or smart homes and smart thermostats. They can do all that if they want to and put it in the plan as well, but they don't have to. Now, something like that in Texas and a number of other states would allow people to actually do something that could be politically feasible, that would not impose a big double whammy on remaining clean assets through suppressing the price, like the ERC regime would, or by making power plants that don't need to retire for compliance retire because they have to pay a big carbon price, and would allow time for the state and the private sector and the businesses that are trying to figure out this entire new system of integrating these things to figure out a bunch of pieces and to deploy them and get the cost down to where the next step, which might be in 2026 or 2028 or 2030, would be really cheap and easy and would create jobs and create more reliability and more employment and more happy customers than if it was done earlier. So, that's... And in the end, that could be a price on carbon by 2030 or 2035, and we'd have, the phase in and all. Now, that's in the Clean Power Plan. It's in there on purpose. It's in there to allow states to do this kind of stuff, but it's not something that I've heard very many people talk about. And I just, going back to fast thinking leads to polarization, and I'm right and you're wrong, or we're right and they're wrong. And slow thinking can lead to consensus. It just seems to me that that's an example that's maybe worth closing my comments with here in Texas. So, thank you very much. And I'd be happy to take some questions.
Steve, NRG is sort of in a unique situation. You've made this announcement that you're, as part of your refinancing plan, you're going to actually get out of some of your cleaner assets, or at least a share of that. And you still have the challenge of owning a lot of coal in Texas. So how is the company seeing its own path forward? I mean, you're sort of implying that the company would like to contribute a schedule down for its plants and not have there be a cap and trade. Am I misinterpreting your comments, or can you say something specific to NRG?
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to say anything too specific, but I will make it clear that I was not volunteering any retirements from NRG in any particular market. I will say that in Illinois, we've already announced a bunch of retirements and repowerings, which would count also, that will get Illinois well on the way towards compliance with the beginning targets of the Clean Power Plan in Illinois. And we think that's something that could make sense in a lot of states, not just for one company to do, but for anybody who owns an asset that is facing uncertain cost recovery of new environmental upgrades to think seriously about. In terms of your bigger question, I think It's a great question, and I think the one of the things I mentioned in my little first part about building up systems, and making sure that things work integrated into systems is integrating into financial markets. And our view is that the challenges we're facing with some of our greener development-oriented businesses is that we need to find a different source of capital for those than the people who like to invest in our existing business, which generates cash, and those consume it for a while. And so I think not to oversimplify, but I think one of the real challenges in making the sort of innovation agenda work is to find ways to do it really in two areas. One is in the sort of incremental evolutionary area, where you think about things like improving the quality, the emission performance, the economic performance, and the heat rate performance even of a existing power plant fleet. That's good business. And that's not a hard sell. Developing something under a PPA or a contract that's immediately accretive and protected in terms of exposure to debt and debt returns, and has low risk on the equity returns. That's just good business. And so there's things that there's kinds of innovation that can we look at in that first bucket of improving our existing fleet and moving it towards our CO2 emission goals, that just make good business sense. The innovative kind of stuff that we're calling green co for now, that the real issue there is matching up the right kind of capital with the right kind of business model. And I think that's frankly something that has huge implications for the stuff the last panel talked about the utility of the future and the business model of the future, because there's no reason to think that people would like a very complicated regulated utility value proposition either.
Dan Cohan from Environmental Engineering at Rice. You spoke about a manageable amount of retirement of coal as being one way that Texas could meet the Clean Power Plan through 2025 or so. What do you think is the best way to have that happen to also help us achieve our air quality goals? NRG runs Plant Parish just outside of town, which has some of the best NOx controls in the world, has SO2 controls on a plant. There are other coal plants, though, that have been shown to contribute substantial amounts to the ozone smog problems in Tyler, Longview, and Dallas-Fort Worth in bankruptcy court now. What do you see as the best ways to ensure that the CO2 goals are met in ways that also get us benefits for equality?
Well, that is a really good question. And I think the challenge is, the way I think about that, and this allows me to answer in a sort of non-resource specific way as well, is it's a question of decision making under uncertainty. The ERCOT analysis of last week about the Clean Power Plan, one of the other wild cards it puts in it is the regional haze FIP and how it might be applied to different plants. And the basic thing in Texas is that if people put a lot of money in the ERCOT side of the market as opposed to the cost of service side, if they put a lot of money into upgrades or additions of scrubbers to meet the FIP thing or anything else, they have to look to the ERCOT wholesale market to get the money back. And that only happens the way the ERCOT market is designed if there's no surplus of capacity in it, if it's sort of just barely enough reserves to keep the lights on, and then prices get high whenever reserves start to get eroded, and hopefully people don't overbuild in response to that. And then there's enough money to get investment in something like pollution control back. But nobody knows if and when that's going to happen. So there's a real sort of people having to make a big bet about will they get their money back or not. And it seems to me that one of the ways that would help with this would be if the environmental regulations that are evolving around the FIP and around the Clean Power Plan allowed basically parties to figure out kind of what their odds are of of surviving or getting their money back if they make investment X or Y, and then having this option of a light-handed regulation up to to some point in time, and then in return for either converting the unit to gas, engaging in only seasonal operation, or retiring it, or doing something else. And so having that option there, I think, would just help people rationalize their decisions about these really big and sometimes very risky investments in pollution control equipment. I don't know if that's the full answer, but question, but I do think some transparency about a path to limit that risk and incorporate that decision making, into looking forward to essentially a state measures approach to the Clean Power Plan.
Gary Hild Foundation for Sustainability. You speak about cap and trade. Would you speak about the selling and buying of carbon credits? The reason I'm asking is that the foundation is planning on planting quite a few acres of Paulownia. China is increasing their cultivation by 150,000 acres per year to deal with their carbon problem, sequestering it. Paulownia is an excellent wood. Mm-hmm. Would you speak about that, please?
Sure. Yeah, so the introduction mentioned that I'm on the board of the Climate Action Reserve, which is one of several organizations that actually certify that particular kinds of intentional carbon reduction activities, including forestry practices, reforestation, and things like destroying ozone, depleting substances and stuff like that, that those things actually are verifiable, measurable, enforceable, that they really produce a ton of CO2 emission reductions. And so from a carbon perspective, we've always felt as a company, and I feel this, that in a carbon trading regime where it's legally allowable for that kind of credit to count for compliance, but they should be very strictly controlled in terms of quality through the certification of reputable organizations. Because it's easy to say, you can plant the trees, and if they there's a drought and they all die, you say, well, I planted them, but they're not taking any CO2 out of the air then. So, there's some verification and some quality control that needs to take place. Now, in the Clean Power Plan, because it's set up under the Clean Air Act, the EPA hasn't made any provision for that kind of credits because they think the Clean Air Act regulates power plants. It doesn't regulate trees. So, they're having they don't want to go that far in terms of the legal risk. More questions? Okay. Thank you.